Hello, my name is Howard Blumenthal, and we are here for another episode of Reinventing School, enough that I'm beginning to lose count, which is really actually kind of a great thing. This is a special episode. We're recording it on Wednesday, not our usual Thursday. Tomorrow we will be doing an episode about cyber attacks and the possibility of that disrupting school. But today, I'm sort of responding to an article that I read I think a week or so ago, called Why It's Mostly Safe to Reopen the Schools. I was really impressed by what I saw, particularly the research that went behind the opinions or the judgments. So I reached out, and sure enough, we have the people who wrote it, or some of the people who wrote it. So I want to kind of focus this a little bit before we get into the conversation. There's a lot of questions now about not only should schools open, but in my mind, how long will schools open once they open up? And then will they close again? And how crazy are we all going to be driven as parents, as teachers, as students, as we get through this initial experiment, if there's not, there may be a better term for it. So with that, I've been scouring the internet and looking for really good, solid research, a well-told story that looks to be the result of a heck of a lot of really good work and really good thinking. So I found it. I'm not sure whether you or me or anybody else is going to agree with all of the conclusions, but it's a starting place that isn't based upon this is what I think, but instead it's based upon we've done the research and here's the directions we think it needs to go. And I as those of you who watch this on a regular basis know, I'm kind of a fan of that kind of critical thinking. So to begin, Avik, and I know you see the lower third, and it's going to look as though Avik is the wrong pronunciation, but Avik apparently is the pronunciation. You have a think tank, but you also have a pretty extensive background beyond this. So could you very briefly explain kind of who you are and how this thing came about?
Well, first of all, Howard, thanks for those kind words about our work and for having us here. It's always great to be with the family at the University of Pennsylvania, people who we know and appreciate and engage with a lot in our work. In terms of what we do and what I do or what my background is and how we put this all together, I could probably spend a lot of time on that, but just to give a little bit of my personal background, I trained as a molecular biologist, and then I went to medical school before getting involved in investing in biotechnology companies and healthcare companies, and then becoming a think tank guy, getting involved in healthcare reform specifically, and then broadening out to the broad range of policy challenges we have in America. And that's what FreeApp, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, does. We focus on trying to bring people together. There's obviously a narrative that we're all divided, we hopelessly are divided against each other, but actually, if you look at data, if you look at political science, if you look at surveys, over 80% of Americans agree that we all want a country in which everyone has a fair shot at success. We may disagree about how exactly to achieve it, but that's inherently our value set. And if that's our value set, then we don't actually fundamentally disagree with each other. We're just arguing about evidence, and that's what we try to do at FreeApp is marshal that evidence towards finding solutions that maybe both Democrats and Republicans and maybe some independents too can find useful as we try to bridge those divides.
Very
so
good.
Go
let me
ahead.
stop you for a second because I want to make sure everybody knows the folks. So Dan Lips, it sounds like you've been at this for a while. And it also sounds as though you know a lot. It seems to me like you've done a great deal of the research in this. So if I can cut over to Dan, tell us about you a little bit and how you got involved in this and what your role is.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be a part of this conversation. I've been following education policy for the past 20 years. From 2000 to 2010, I worked for state and national public policy organizations researching and writing about education policy. Over the past 10 years, my career changed and I started working in government. I had been pursuing academic graduate studies in national security work, and I joined the FBI and ultimately ended up working on the staff of the Senate Homeland Security Committee as an investigator and policy director. But the whole time I was following education policy and also became very involved in the policymaking process in Washington. And when I had the opportunity to leave Capitol Hill, I was really excited to join the team at FreeApp, because what I saw on the Hill was that we really needed organizations that were focused on finding common ground around values that really everyone agrees about, such as promoting equal opportunity. So the opportunity to join Avik and the team and researching and writing about ed policy was something I was really excited about.
Good. So thank you for that. And Preston, you're the third member of a team that has some more people. So if you could sort of acknowledge some of the other people who have been working on, whose names appear in the article, that would be good. And tell us a little bit about you.
I'm Preston Cooper, and I work on higher education policy for FreeApp, higher education and post-secondary education. So everything from the traditional colleges and universities to alternative credentials like apprenticeships and workforce training. And I also want to acknowledge Lan Hee Chen and Bob Kosher, who were our fourth and fifth co-authors on this paper. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here today, but they're instrumental in getting this research project across the finish line and in contributing a bunch of the research that went into it. So just to acknowledge them.
Thank you. Well, let me give you my starting place, and because the audience sort of is aware of this. I love the idea of having students in school. It seems like the right thing to do. And although I have a lot of questions about what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one with those questions, it seems like the best invention, one of the best inventions that humankind has come up with so far. And we do it all around the world, and we do it in more similar than different ways around the world. And I know that because I travel the world for this Kids on Earth project that a lot of our viewers know about as well, where I basically go into a school and interview kids and say, tell me about your life and tell me about your hopes and dreams. And what I found is that this generation, let's call it post-iPhone or similar, regardless of whether they have the technology or not, tends to have more agency, be more empowered, more aware, and more capable of teaching one another with or without the internet. We're in a different era than I think we were in 2000. So with that, let's focus on US schools, particularly. We'll get to the international in a few minutes. It seems to me that we have a lot of very frightened teachers, and we need them to be able to play the school game, because without the teachers, it's hard to do. It seems to me that many of the teachers, I'll call it 20%, you may know the number better, 20 or 25%, who are old enough thinking, this might be a little scary. I'm not sure that I necessarily want to enter a school building with other adults, no less the kids. So that question. And then the other piece is we don't know what this virus, we don't know much about this virus yet. It's still a new idea. We still are looking at solutions that are a year or 2 years away. So not only is it scary, and I'm talking about the emotional side of this, which is important, as is the research, but also the strangeness of if a teacher in the next school district has to be a parent because their schools aren't available, that takes one teacher out of the local district. So my wife works at school, and she's watching just the number of available staff drop. So any attempts to do this in an organized way are becoming really difficult. So you have a lot of different factors, and I know you guys know a lot about that. So what are the key factors that a teacher in a district who's kind of on the edge, district is doing the best they can, they're using the available research. So rather than looking at the high level, let's look at the level of what do I do if I'm a teacher and I'm not completely sure how to think about this? And how does your research and your wonderful website, which we should point to, in fact, we'll put a URL up when we do the recorded version of this. How do I think about this? Where do I start?
By the way, Howard, we actually published on our website frequently asked questions pages for parents of school-age children, teachers, and school administrators, just to try to make that very user-friendly and easy to access. But I'll talk about the public health side and let Dan and Preston talk about the more logistical side of school operations. On the public health side, here's what we know. Leaving aside the emotion, and obviously there's understandable concern, fear, everything that you described. Scientifically, we do know enough about how the virus works to be able to say this. The risk of younger people dying or having serious illness from COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, is extremely low. In the case of school-age children, we're talking about 1 in 1.5 million is the chance of death. And for serious illness, it's obviously the odds are higher, but still very, very low. Total in the United States, a country of 330 million people, of which 40 million are school-age children, 36 have died of the disease. And you might say 36 is too many, but many more people of that age die drowning in swimming pools.
Well, I was going to ask you for some context.
Cancer.
So what's the largest cause of death in that age group? Accidents, I would think?
Yeah, in fact, I have a chart on our website, which I can share with you if I'm able to share my screen, or if not, I can just walk through.
Yeah, just walk us through quick.
Yeah, walk through the numbers. So here's what I'll do. I'll just kind of recite the numbers. Yeah. And let's talk about kids aged 10 to 14 as an example. Good. So in kids aged 10 to 14, 14 or so have died of COVID-19 this year. If we assume that for this analysis, we're assuming that 200,000 people in America die of COVID-19. So these are proportional numbers. So assuming 200,000 total deaths from the disease in the United States, 14 will die in the ages 10 to 14 from COVID-19. Unintentional injury is the top cause of death at 847. Suicide, 436. Cancer, malignant neoplasms, 431.
No.
Homicide, 147.
Are you looking at kids in that age group? Because cancer is number 3 in that? Really? Okay.
Yeah, kids in that age group. Unintentional injury is number 1. Cancer is number 3. So let's take kids aged 1 to 4. Kids aged 1 to 4, there will at 200,000 total deaths, 13 of those will be from COVID-19 in that age group, compared to 1,261 from unintentional injury or accidents, 433 from birth defects, 377 from cancer, 339 from homicide, 118 from heart disease, 103 from influenza or pneumonia.
So one of the things that deeply concerns me is when you look at overall population, not just kids, diabetes is a very large percentage, particularly as you get older, right? Suicide, but we don't seem to be spending anything like the attention to diabetes or to any of the other major causes of death that we seem to be spending on COVID. Now, there's a lot more unknowns about COVID. We know a lot more about diabetes and diabetes care. But when I visited a Philadelphia charter school, one of the students was about 12 years old, quite overweight. And we had a little side conversation about her blood sugar and her weight and all that. And she said her father took insulin every day. And she knew absolutely nothing about diabetes. She said, why don't you know anything about this? Your father, yeah, he doesn't really talk about it much. Well, do you have like a doctor? Well, we have a clinic. Well, how about your teachers? Well, they don't really know much about it. And I said, well, what about this? And then I happen to know the head of the charter school. So just out of curiosity, she said, yeah, we had a grant funded program 5 years ago. I'm like, doesn't really help her because it was over when, so we don't teach public health very well, was kind of what I walked away with. So the fact that I don't know these numbers and I've been studying this scares me because I should know these numbers. And I'm guessing that most people who are involved in school districts administration and the like probably don't know these numbers either. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, in fact, there was an elegant survey done recently that actually broke out by age bracket. What's your perception of your risk of death from COVID, and compared that to the actual risk? And it's the opposite of what I just described. Instead of it, risk of COVID death is massively high in the elderly. 80% of all deaths from COVID occur in people over 65. Less than 0.1% occur in kids under 15. But if you look at the actual polls and say, what's your perception of your risk? It's more the other way around. It's young people who are scared. And that tells you where the media has done a bad job of really accurately characterizing the risk. 45% of all deaths from COVID-19 have taken place in nursing homes, which house 0.6% of the population.
Yeah.
So there's a huge skew there. But the other piece of it that's really important for our conversation and your original question is, okay, so let's stipulate that the risk of the kids themselves dying of COVID is extremely low, of getting serious illness extremely low. Can they infect the teachers, their parents, with the virus? And is that a risk? Because we all have the experience as parents of catching the bugs that kids transmit to each other in schools. So the Wall Street Journal article that you showed on screen there, the bulk of the article is really describing that problem in terms of what do we know about the science of kids infecting adults with the coronavirus. And there, the story is also very encouraging, especially for younger children under the age of 12. For high schoolers, it's a bit, it's still encouraging, but there's some counter arguments and countervailing data. And that's where we talk about the real world experience in Europe, in which they did not see a real risk, or really any risk of outside that you would see above the normal population of teachers being infected.
But I'm more worried about adult to adult.
Yes, that's very important, and that's where the way you operate a grocery store, the way you operate other workplaces that have been in operation in this time frame are really important to think about. Can you create the same kinds of safety protocols in a school that you do in other workplaces? And that's maybe something where I'll let Dan and Preston take the floor if that's
good.
Okay.
Dan, tell us about it.
Sure.
And before you do, one comment from the chat is, so essentially this is a crapshoot. Should I think, okay, not my child, maybe yours, drowning in a pool is not contagious. So there is an emotional impact on beliefs here. Can you lift off, kind of blast off from there?
Sure. I think it's important for, I would like to convey that our overarching recommendation for education policy during the pandemic is to provide teachers, parents, students, school employees, and communities with flexibility. I think that much of our paper builds on Avik's work of trying to understand or to better understand the public health risks, and it's important for the public to be educated about that. That said, at the end of the day, these are going to be decisions, as you described, Howard, of parents and teachers deciding whether it's safe for their kids or for the teacher to go back into the school. And as a matter of education policy, what we should be trying to do, and what we recommend in our paper, is to provide a range of options for communities. Building on the recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's lots of safety guidelines that can be pursued by schools to minimize the risk of transmission. These are practical things like grouping kids in cohorts, right. Trying to minimize crossover between adults and students, spacing, the use of personal protective equipment, ventilation, holding classes outside where possible.
I love all that, but then I hang out with second graders. And sure. It doesn't matter that you've got these lists. It doesn't matter that there's guidelines. They're still going to be second graders. And they're still going to hug and they're still going to be little germ machines because that's what they do, right? Well, so if I'm an adult and I'm seeing that coming towards me, I'm running the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair for teachers to be concerned. We think that there would be valuable for there to be choice, and for teachers have the ability to stay home. We should be expanding opportunities for people who are willing to teach and to serve in that capacity to go back to school. One of the risks that we talk about in the paper, and we think is really overlooked in this conversation, is the educational, the health, and social and emotional risks of having the entire country have children stay home for months on end. There's grave public health risks and the potential for increased abuse that we are seeing reports of increased child abuse incidents at emergency rooms, yet reports of child abuse are down in part because our closed schools traditionally serve on the front lines of our child welfare system. Educationally,
but let's be careful about overstating that too. I mean, yes, it's an issue, but about 25% of college students experience some form of mental illness every year. There's a survey, they survey about 25,000 students. So is the number up to 27,000? Is the number up to 50,000? Like, how severe is it? And how much worse would it be if little Juanita was hanging out at home for a month or for 2 months or for 3 months? Is that a substantial difference? Understanding the frontline issue of, like, I don't want to overstate that.
In terms of child abuse, we basically don't have enough data on this, in part because kids are all home. We've had anecdotal reports of, in New York City, for example, 1 month this summer, The child abuse reports were down by 50%. What does that mean for the kids who can't get back to school? Educationally, we know that children, generally, there's something called the summer learning slide, where if you're out of school for 3 months, you return to school having lost a little bit of the learning gains you made during the prior school year. Right now, we've had kids out of school for 6 months. So as they're heading back, we know that academic researchers have looked at it and estimated that kids will have lost a half of year's learning in math and a third of the year's learning in reading. And that's if schools reopen. McKinsey recently put out a report that estimated that if schools stay closed for the remainder of the fall, low-income students will have lost a year's worth of learning. So for many kids, this is their best chance to have an education, to be in a safe environment. And so we should be doing everything we can to either provide them with that in-school learning opportunity, or something we talk a lot about in the paper, try and provide them with flexible outside of school learning options.
And we should talk about that in some detail. What we're going to do now, just to get a little bit of a breather, is we typically take like a 30-second break, show a little promo of what's coming up. When we come back, I want to talk about those learning opportunities. Let me lay out a scenario. We open schools because everything you're saying makes sense. It's a safer place. We're going to solve mental health issues. The kids are going to be able to catch up on, or at least be able to get to where they need to be from a curriculum's point of view. All good. But people start getting sick, and we can't expect a rational response. We've got a crazy political situation on the one hand. We have media that gets really excited when there's a story. So it's going to become messy. I'm going to take that as highly likely. So if that's true, and by the middle of October, we've got a mess on our hands. What does that mess look like? Well, it means a lot of kids at home. So here's a couple of different points. Number one, from what I found, distance learning requires broadband and devices and the logistics of a home space where you can actually use them with reasonable quiet, place where you can pay some attention. So I don't think more than 40%, and I'm thinking maybe closer to 35% of US students K-12 have that facility. I don't think 2/3 do, and I'm seeing Dan shake his head. So if that's so, and schools close, and this is as messy as I suspect it will be, then what do we do next? What does the school district do when they've tried distance learning, it's not working so well, and there's a lot of kids who aren't paying attention? What do we do when the physical school building isn't really available? So the best answer I've found so far is pods, which seem like this massive opportunity, really clever idea, and absolutely not something that I want to put together for the entire country in 6 weeks. But I think that's where this is going to go. I think it's already going there based upon the popularity of that episode that we produced 2 weeks ago, and also the number of Facebook members that these Facebook groups are. I mean, I'm tracking this every day. This is where the action is right now. And school districts are beginning to think maybe we should do pods too. Like we're just in a different era than we've ever been before. So can you parse that for me? And Preston, if you have something to say here, we've been kind of chatting and we haven't forgotten about you. But anybody want to jump in and take that?
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think it's been really exciting to see that parents are taking the responsibility and taking it into their own hands by forming pods and recognizing that as their schools are closed, that they need to find something better than Zoom classes and very limited one-on-one instruction from teachers. The big issue here is equity. We know that families in the upper income brackets, you spend about $9,000 per year on their child's education. Families in the lowest income brackets, you spend about $1,000 or less. We know that
you're talking beyond tax money, right? You're talking about in addition to the money that we would pay for school districts.
To clarify, that's enrichment and outside of school expenditures. So these are summer camps, enrichment programs, the things that families with means take for granted. It's the families that have access to resources are hiring tutors. They're partnering with other families to hire individual teachers to teach a small group of children. These are really promising ideas, and there's some advantages.
But that's not the people who I'm interacting with. There is the rich person's toy. I understand that. We all acknowledge that. I'm talking about people who are middle and lower income, who are getting together in their apartment, in the extra room downstairs in the apartment building, outside in the playground, and they're not hiring a teacher. One of them is saying, I know somebody who, or my friend is a recent college graduate. They're doing the best they can with it, but it's not, I don't think the predominant trend here is wealth. I think the predominant trend here is lifeboat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our recommendation in our paper is that we should be giving all families access to those lifeboats. So if there's ways to provide some funding that can be used to acquire instructional materials, to pay for childcare, to hire a tutor, that's what we need to do to address the equity gap, because that's the only way we can ensure that children have the ability to access some outside of school learning resources. I read a story today about in some communities, kids huddling around McDonald's because they could get access to free Wi-Fi trying to learn in the parking lot.
Yeah, public libraries everywhere now are offering those services. School buses are riding around with hotspots. So all that's happening, but that still assumes that we've got devices. Yeah. I'm wondering, where do you get those additional tutors? Should we have a core of some sort, New Deal style, train a whole lot of people to be able to help out, particularly in lower income communities? Because I don't know where if mom is working, dad's not there, whatever the dynamic is, that's a real problem on a very large scale for 10 to 20 million kids. And this is an October problem. This is not a December or March problem. What do you do with that? Have you guys covered that? I'm asking you questions as if you know every answer in the future. That's not a fair thing to do. You've written an excellent report, but you're not seeing into the future.
One of the recommendations that we've made is to lower barriers to entry into the teacher workforce by reducing licensing burdens. There's a lot of research that looks at the benefit of alternative teacher certification programs. And there's been some recent research in Education Next looking at, in the past, when we have economic recessions, it's actually a great time to bring new people into the teaching workforce. Recognizing that this is not a scenario anyone has planned for, school districts and communities should be trying to flexibly allow more people to serve in roles of providing childcare and providing teaching for all the reasons you talked about.
Yeah, how does that go when you talk to a district? Because having sat through school board meetings, the idea of doing anything that's not specifically on that very narrowly defined agenda is a problem. You're saying, heck, why don't we just have more people come in and help? That sounds like a good idea, but not in any of the district meetings I've ever been to.
Well, this would be above the district level, right? So the idea here is you'd provide funding at the federal or state level to parents through education savings accounts, 529s, or other tools that the parents could then use to hire those tutors. So it wouldn't be done through the school district or the school board or that chain of command, so to speak. So you're giving the parents the ability to apply that funding to whatever they think their child needs. And the advantage of it, and one of the reasons why, in the Wall Street Journal paper and in the FreeApp paper itself, we emphasize the microschools or pods idea is because not only is it a way to address the equity problem of upper middle class or middle class people being able to do that, but not lower income folks, but it's also a tool for innovation, right? We're going to discover so much about effective forms of pedagogy using technology. Like you said, the younger people are more fluent in the technology. Let's figure out how to best deploy that technology. We obviously are not doing a great job of it right now. And to just give your audience a better sense of how we thought about it in the major research paper at freeapp.org, as I mentioned at the outset, the children themselves are at very, very low risk of serious illness or death from COVID. The risk of infecting the adults, parents, and teachers is also very low, especially for the youngest children. But for those older children and for people with pre-existing conditions or other vulnerabilities, you will still need to have remedies or ways to address those individuals who, for whatever reason, cannot go to school. And so 80 to 90% of our paper is really about all those asterisks and caveats, right, how you address all those different populations from the childcare, pre-K setting, all the way up to the college and post-secondary setting.
So I read the paper. Who else reads the paper? It's an obvious question, but who's paying attention?
A great question. Actually, quite a few people based on our traffic stats. And what I'd say is typically what our white papers are designed for is policymakers. Usually if we're writing on any topic, the people who are reading it in a lot of depth are typically either elected officials or the people who work for those elected officials, the staffers, or more granular people. Maybe they're unelected people who work in government, in the executive branches of governments at the state, local, or federal level. They're the ones reading it. They're the ones asking questions, et cetera, of us. This is a special case, though, because you have so many parents who have a stake, as well as obviously the kids, in the safety of getting back to school, that we're getting enormous amount of interest from parents and teachers who really want the best information and the best ideas to make this work in this challenging time.
How does that reintegrate with the real world? Because certainly the people my wife interacts with, the people who I interact with, who are teachers and principals and district people, even initiating a discussion like this, they look at me with their overload light on. They just really want to know, will I be able to get into the classroom to get the stuff I'll need at home? And my computer's, like the P key on the computer is shaky, so every time I touch the P key, it's a problem. So is there a different Chromebook, and what's the process that I go through for that? And by the way, my password won't work on the new one, so can I have one of the old ones again? And then I have a problem with the plug, and I don't know what kind of extension cord to use. That's the discussion. So you're talking about something that's way up here. I'm having trouble engaging anybody who's got that on the ground role in anything like this discussion. And it drives me crazy because I think this is a very important discussion to have, because we're all living in this in October, at least by my reckoning. Why aren't we talking? Why is this the only article I've read? There's just not enough attention being paid to what happens after distance learning doesn't work and what happens after. There's a lot of good ideas. Pods are starting to get a little bit of attention. That's great. The last week or two, we've seen a lot of media on that. But is that the only alternative? Because if it is, it seems like a pretty sloppy one right now.
Well, Preston and Dan can speak to their experience. I can just tell you for myself and for the team that at FreeApp, we are inundated with engagement on this topic. So we're seeing a lot of it, but obviously it's self-selected because we're the ones writing about it. So I can't speak to obviously your experience, but we are seeing people from all walks of life who care about this issue. It's such an important issue for so many people. Yeah. 60 million people, Americans, go to school of some kind, and that's not counting the parents. So this is an enormously important issue, and we're seeing it. It's not every single person, but it's quite a lot of people that are interacting and engaging with our research on this topic.
Preston, what are you thinking about?
So what I'm kind of thinking about is that Avik mentioned, education savings accounts and trusting, parents and students to be able to make decisions with those funds. And I wanted to mention, I work on higher education, and we already quasi have that system at the higher education level, where we have federal Pell Grants and state grants and federal student loans, and that you can take those to the higher education outlet of your choice, that if you want to go to an in-person college, you'll be able to do that. But if you also are uncomfortable going back in person, you can also go to an online college, or you can find a college that is offering something in between. So there's options like blended learning, where you're not meeting in person every single day, but you might be, if you have a class that would normally meet 3 days a week, maybe that class can meet 1/3 of a class each meets 1 time per week. And so you have a lot fewer people in the classroom, and you can complete the rest of your coursework online.
But doesn't that triple the number of teacher hours?
No, it keeps the same number of teacher hours, because if you have a normal class that's meeting, say, for 3 1-hour sessions per week, the teacher's working 3 hours during normal times. During COVID times, you have 1/3 of the class meet 1 hour per week, 1 hour per week each. So 1/3 meets on Monday, 1/3 meets on Wednesday, 1/3 meets on Friday.
Right.
The teacher's just there.
But if I'm a student and I want 3/3, then I need the teacher to teach 3x, not 1x.
Well, actually,
right?
There's actually some economic literature on this that shows that if you have distance learning combined with that one little bit of face-to-face interaction, so the professor puts the PowerPoint slides and recordings of past lectures online, and the students can watch that for 2/3 of the week, and then they meet together for 1/3 of the week in order to get together and discuss the material and ask questions. And there have been studies on this, comparing this sort of blended learning to fully in-person learning, and found that the learning outcomes are actually no different. That just having that one little bit of in-person interaction, that one little bit of being able to actually meet the professor face-to-face, even if it's just for 1 hour of the week, and ask questions and talk with your classmates and discuss these issues, that really provides the learning outcomes that we expect from in-person.
Let me be clear here. I'm paying 100% of the fee for 1/3 of the exposure, and I'm doing it on a loan? No way.
Yes.
No way.
Well,
who says yes to that? That's crazy.
I think that's a decision that will be up to individual students. I mean, if I'm an individual student and I say I don't think that's a good deal, you know, I can say no, thank you. But if I'm a student and I say, you know what, I'm really interested in getting this degree so that I can get out into the labor market and get a job, maybe this is the best option for me. I think that what we need to think about is empowering students to make choices that are best for them. So if you think that this blended learning is just not worth it, then you can say no, thank you. But if you think that it might be worth it for you, then you can also, you can do that.
I'm sorry. The logic of that does not scan for me at all, but thank you. On the elementary level, or on the K through 12 level, I'm not taking out a loan. I'm not investing any more money. I'm giving you my tax money. In fact, I don't have kids in school right now, but I'm giving the tax money anyway because I believe this is a good thing. I'm paying for citizenship. So I'm paying for democracy. I'm a big supporter of that. I think it's a great idea. But I don't want that money to be squandered. I'm not interested in having low results, and I'm not sure I necessarily want to be funding pods that are disorganized, that don't produce the results that are necessary. And yet, if pods are our only available solution, because distance learning has all of these issues around it, so only, let's call it 1/3 of students are getting that, and we can't put kids in school, the economic basis for this starts fading away from me. Not that I don't want to see it happen, but I want to see well thought out methodology, or at least a lot of really good experimentation. Well, you know, it doesn't sound to me like these pieces connect, or am I missing something?
Yeah, Howard, I would, in a sense, take your question and look at it from the opposite side of the glass, which is to say what we're seeing in the real world right now is private schools. It kind of, it's related in a sense to your college question. Private schools at the K through 12 level and the pre-K level are working hard to operate and open safely where they're being allowed to, because to your point, if the private school is not open, the parents will not send the tuition dollars to that school. Right. What's the point? Yeah. So the private schools have a powerful economic incentive not to be reckless, because they care about their own safety as teachers and administrators, and of course parents and kids as well, but to figure out the solutions. How do we operate a school safely? Because if we don't, we may close for good. So they have a powerful reason to figure it out. Whereas I think what we're seeing to some degree on the public school side is if your tax dollars, Howard's and mine, and Dan's and Preston's and everyone on this, listening to this today, if our tax dollars are going to be spent on that school and those administrators and teachers anyway, your incentives are very different. Your incentives are to be incredibly cautious about safety because there's no economic incentive to do anything other than that. So that's the economic equation that we're seeing in the pre-K and K through 12 level that is to Dan's point, really widening inequities because as the private schools reopen and reopen safely, because the European experience is really powerful that schools can reopen safely, as a matter of fact. Private schools are reopening, which means the parents with means and their kids are gonna get that educational benefit, and the kids who are dependent on the public system are not.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with you. That's a big problem. What are we doing to solve that in the next 6 weeks or in the next 8 weeks? What movement have we seen, or what movement do we need to see in a very specific way at the state level, I guess, because those are the ones who, because trying to do it at a federal level in the middle of election season seems to me to be a fool's attempt. But if we take it state by state, do the states pay for some sort of a coronavirus relief force and train mini teachers or whatever you want to call them? Do we provide money to parents to buy services, although I don't know who they're going to buy services from? How do you put this together for tens of millions? We can all estimate what that number is. How do you make it work in the short term? Who do we need to call? Who needs to see this program and say, do this, please? How does this work?
There's a lot of dimensions to that answer, and I'll let Dan and Preston pipe in on their pieces of it. A couple things to mention from my side of it, which is one, we're going to see obviously a spectrum of policy situations, right? So in Florida, for example, where the Governor DeSantis said, no, schools got to reopen, you got to figure it out. We're going to see widespread school reopenings. In Texas, similarly, although it's a bit more graduated, the private schools are opening earlier, the public schools a little bit more on a delay, but the schools are going to reopen. And if those experiences in general are positive, and by positive I mean, the schools open and the kids don't die of COVID.
If nothing bad happens, right?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say nothing, because this is one part of the problem is you have these school districts where people are saying, oh, one person tested positive of COVID, let's shut down the entire school and give up. That's just insanity. You shouldn't have even bothered to reopen the school at all if you're going to shut it down if there's a single positive case. You've got to have a plan in place for when positive cases happen, quarantine that individual, any really close contacts perhaps. But again, because the infectivity of younger children is so low, the necessity of a broader shutdown is questionable. But you have to have a plan in place. And my hope is that, kind of like with new technology, where usually there's a handful of people who adopt the new technology first, like a smartphone, then more and more people do it, then everybody has one. Similarly here, you're going to have some places dip their toes in the water. Hopefully those experiences are good in the sense of no real outbreaks, no real death and serious illness. Obviously, positive tests will happen. And if that experience goes reasonably well along the European lines, more and more people will get comfort around it. Maybe after the election, the whole thing will be depoliticized. Obviously, that's several months from now, but we could hope for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Dan?
I'll just add to that to your question about how can we direct resources to families if schools are closed. Under the CARES Act, this is the emergency aid package that passed Congress, signed by the president back in the spring. Governors got several $1 billion that they could use really unilaterally to try and provide aid and to improve education while schools are closed and as they're reopening. Some of that aid is being used to try and acquire protective equipment and get schools ready to safely reopen. Several states have actually provided education savings accounts and direct funding to families for educational services while schools are closed. And there's a big debate happening in Washington right now about the next round of education funding. And I think you'll continue to see more pushes to see if any emergency aid is provided for it to go directly to families.
Should it go directly to families, or should it go to tutors or whatever you want to call mentors or whatever the word is? In other words, as a family, particularly if I'm in a lower income bracket and I'm having issues, the first place that goes is food. Well, even if you're giving them money for education, I'm going to spend it on a hierarchy of needs. And what I wonder about is do I need the services? And if I do need the services, how do you create the workforce for those services? And then how do you work out the provisioning? Because I need a social studies teacher for 10th graders, but you need somebody to handle your first graders. And we're both in the same pod.
I think I would approach that with a bottom-up solution of giving families choices with some oversight of the funding. That can be done through education savings accounts that have restricted use and can only be spent on certain providers. It's a difficult situation, but I don't think we can trust a top-down solution when we've seen school districts themselves really fail to provide adequate services.
Does that network of providers exist at a scale that would service 10 or 20 million students? I can't imagine it would, because if we didn't need it before, those people would never have built their careers that way. So are these all going to be newcomers?
I think there's going to be very different creative solutions that are going to be developed. Something that one example is there's the microschool network, Prenda Schools is scaling up. Yeah. There's been some creative ideas about trying to scale distance learning provided by online charter schools while having a teacher in the classroom, also, or in a small school setting, providing the childcare, tutoring, coaching service. There's going to be a lot of creative bottom-up solutions. As you mentioned earlier, we're seeing families partnering and searching Facebook to find potential allies in a pod. We're going to see more of that. And unfortunately, what we saw back in the spring was that as school districts tried to turn to remote overnight, many big school districts, provided nearly zero services. So I think I would vote that we have a better chance of having a bottom-up solution where parents have the ability to try or find arrangements that work for their children, using public funding.
My heart believes you. My brain does not. Here's why. When I've attended a lot of school board meetings over the very recent past. Agenda item number 1, disinfectants. Agenda item number 2, school buses. When you get to creative solutions, it's 10:30 or 11 at night or 1 in the morning. The meeting's been going on for 5 hours. It's not a priority. Safety is a priority. Figuring out a way to maintain the status quo is, but when you're saying all of this stuff will happen, this has to be fully engaged and fully enrolled in 2 months. Does that network of activity exist in the United States? If it has, I understand that it's emerging, but we don't have a lot of time, or do we? And maybe my time estimates are completely out the window. But
one thing we know is
I'm hopeful.
Right now, millions of families are pulling their kids out of school and deciding to homeschool for this year.
Yes.
We've seen that.
So the customers are there.
We're likely to see a doubling or tripling or more of homeschooling this school year as schools stay closed.
So what is that, 5%, 10%, 15, 20%?
Well, I think that the population of homeschoolers is something like 2 million. And there's surveys that show that there's dramatic doubling of homeschooling applications.
It's 4 million out of 60 million. Who cares?
Well, I think that we're going to see several million. And the question is, we know that there's earlier this month, we looked at the 120 largest school districts in the United States. Yeah. We found that 71 of them are going to provide no in-person learning to start the school year. Some of the biggest school districts in the country, Chicago, Los Angeles, and you name a big city, it's likely that they're going to be opening remote. And we know from the evidence of the learning loss that millions of kids are not going to be having an education as we start the fall.
So let's stay there for a second. So if we agreed before that about a third of students have access to distance learning, and we know that about half or more of schools are going to be reliant upon distance learning in the largest districts, but we know distance learning is, for many, a road to nowhere. So if pods are our next available idea, then how is it that every school district is not focused on building that alternative now so that it'll be available September 15th? I'm mystified, especially that you're saying you're seeing a lot of attention around this. That's good. I want to see that newspaper story tomorrow that says that South Dakota opened 2,000 pods and they plan to open 7,000 more. And even that is a number that's insignificant based upon, I don't know what South Dakota's population is. But
the problem is that the politics are not, and the economic incentives for that school district to empower parents to do that are in the opposite direction. And maybe it was a leading question you were asking, but that's the view of a lot of public school districts and teachers unions and the like is that if you were to do that, you're taking funding away from me and giving it to the parents to do with it whatever they want, right. And that's a threat to my way of life and my situation. And that's a big part of why, in a sense, you have to, or at least the paradigms that seem workable are to go around that system where the state or the federal government provides relief funding directly to parents. But that's the hostility. The hostility, it's similar in a sense of the hostility for charter schools, but obviously it's a little bit different in character, but similar. I mean, microschools are effectively a kind of micro charter school where instead of it going through all the physical plant and other bureaucratic hurdles of a charter school, you're just taking a group of people and they're having a cooperative, you could say, or a collective to teach their kids. And the thing is, and you alluded to this as well, and again, Dan and Preston can talk about this much better than I can. This model exists. This is not something that was invented during the COVID-19 pandemic. The micro school approach to learning has been around for it's obviously been around for millennia, really, but it's particularly taken off in the United States in the last several decades, let's say, and particularly last several years. So there are micro school operators that have been doing this and doing this well and looking for interested parents to expand their model to new areas. And I think that's where it's going to have to come from. So states and the federal government are going to have to take the initiative, because I just don't see the school district having the incentive to see those dollars go elsewhere. They want the dollars to go to them.
I'm with you. So let's play the numbers game for a second. If we've got, let's call it 4 million homeschoolers by the end of next year, 2021, and we've got 4 million people in microschools or pods, that would be a large number. It still leaves the vast majority of students in no situation at all. Their school is closed. The school district's not reopening. Distance learning sounds like a really good idea, but I can't do it in my house and neither can my friend. And we don't want to have the kid lose the, fall behind, even further behind. But it sounds like we've set up a scenario where that's exactly what's going to happen to at least half of the student body in the United States, and that's terrifying. Now, I'm looking to you guys, and part of what I'm doing, again, unfairly, is to say, so solve it. And it's not within your realm to solve it, but it is within your realm to offer solutions, which you're doing. And again, I want to strongly recommend that anybody who's watching, have a look at the website. Here's the URL again. We'll be putting it up in the when we do the recorded version. Because there really are answers out there somewhere, but more of it relies upon individual responsibility than the state magically causing a solution to appear. A lot of this is going to really rely upon individual students and individual parents, piling it on to the other issues that households have now. But I'm not seeing a better solution than that. And I think that's very unfortunate, because we're capable of that. But this is still a nation that doesn't provide broadband to an enormous number of people and continues to drive social issues through the middle of every logical, reasonable argument. So here we are. And now we've got what I believe is a crisis on our hands, or will soon be. I want those schools to reopen. I want you to be right and say that schools should reopen because of the health considerations. I'm not feeling like we proved that case in this hour. I'm feeling like it's a good idea and a desirable one for a lot of good reasons, but I don't see the wind blowing that way. Tell me.
I think there is, and Dan testified before Congress recently on this specific topic. I mean, there is real interest at the federal level and in certain states for providing some of this funding to help parents enroll their kids in alternatives to the school districts. But obviously, for the reasons you've described, the emphasis is on getting the school districts reopening, because that's the, in a sense, simplest solution. If you get the school districts comfortable reopening, then that's the simplest solution. And they should reopen, especially for those pre-K, kindergarten, elementary level kids. They should reopen. And that's the main thing we've tried to do, is persuade them that they should. But nonetheless, and that's why what you've described, the fact that it's so hard to come up with better alternatives to schools in the short term. In the long term, we may try to get the silver lining here. Maybe we can use build on the microschool model, build on virtual, figure out how to do these things so that in the future those models are more viable to more people. But in terms of right now, in the short term, the best solution is reopen the schools, again, particularly for those young children. And if they're unwilling to, then they've failed to do what they can do based on the science, but based on what we know about this virus.
What's plan B?
Dan?
I would point out that there is precedent for Congress stepping in and providing emergency relief that follows a child to an alternative education setting of their choice. Back in 2005, when the Hurricane Katrina and Rita hit the Gulf Coast, 200,000 kids were displaced from their schools. Their schools were physically closed. But that fall, a bipartisan movement gained steam in Congress, and in the Katrina spending package, there was billions in aid that was provided directly to follow children to a school of their choice. Right now, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars in new aid for K-12 schooling. At the hearing that I testified at earlier this month, former Education Secretary Arne Duncan proposed $200 billion in new spending for K-12. If schools are closed, we know that schools spend $14,000 per child. Some of that funding could go directly to the family to access other services. And layering on top of that, tens of billions in new federal aid, there's a real opportunity to give families choices outside of the closed school setting.
Fascinating. I would like to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to roll the credits. If you guys can hang out for 5 minutes afterwards, that would be great. Okay? So,
thank you.
Preston, Dan, Avik, thank you very much for the official part of the presentation. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.